Thank you very much. So we are on the cusp of a potentially dramatic institutional change in professional sports in the United States, comparable to the one that occurred in the late 70s and early 80s, where for the first time in history, professional athletes were allowed to achieve, midway through their career, extensive free agency and be able to pick the team they played for. I want to, and it's manifest itself right now in litigation going on in Minnesota, of which you know a tiny little part, because only one of the 4 antitrust cases against the NFL are actually in the news. There's several others going on as well. The gist of all this, I think, is important. On the one hand, we have antitrust policy, which is a commitment as a matter of public policy to the notion that we should try to maintain competitiveness in markets. That doesn't mean that all monopolies are illegal. The way the antitrust laws work, if you obtain a monopoly because of superior efficiency, innovativeness, you produce better products or you produce products at lower costs, that's okay. There's no antitrust issue in becoming a monopoly because you're better. There is an antitrust issue, however, if you engage in what the law calls anti-competitive conduct to obtain a monopoly in a market. And the most obvious way to obtain a monopoly in a market is to combine yourselves, either through a merger or through a collusive agreement, whereby people who compete with each other agree not to compete. They agree to set a common price or to adopt common practices so that the intensity of competition against them is reduced. They're able to charge higher prices or to pay less for their inputs and thereby increase their profitability. Within antitrust laws, there are a number of activities that are called per se antitrust violations, which means there's no possible defense. Once you have been found to do it, that's over. You've lost. One of them is something called horizontal price fixing, where a group of competitors get together and agree to charge a common price. And the other is something called a group boycott, where you all agree not to do business with somebody as a punishment for them not acceding to your wishes. Now, this is all fairly abstract, but think about player markets in professional sports. Player markets in professional sports have salary caps. They have individual player caps. They have various restrictions on which teams are allowed to bid for the services of which players. The most extreme of which is called the rookie free agent draft, which is going on right now in the NFL, whereby the teams in sequential order, get to pick a player for whom they have the exclusive rights to for 4 years. That is to say, that player either plays for the team that drafts him or plays for nobody. Now, these are all classic examples of prohibited, per se, antitrust violations. They're dividing the market, giving exclusive bargaining power to a particular team so they can drive down the price. They are fixing the overall salary bill for a team. They are fixing the fraction of the salary bill that can be paid to rookies. So there's no issue at all, abstracting from everything else, that most of the practices in professional sports are sort of no-brainer antitrust violations. But then there's another body of law, which is labor law. 100 years ago, after the various antitrust statutes had been passed in the United States, the Sherman Act, the Federal Trade Act, the Clayton Act, management was able to inflict serious damage on unions, the nascent union movement in the United States, by suing it for antitrust violation. That is to say, when a group of workers got together and said, we want to bargain with you collectively to set a common wage for all of us, That sounds just exactly like the price fixing argument that I gave before. When a group of workers said, because we don't like the offer you've given us, we're going to go on strike, that sounds exactly like a group boycott. And so, in the period in the 1900 to 1920 era, many unions were busted by management, by courts concluding that unions violated the antitrust laws. As a result, between 1920 and the mid-1930s, several statutes were passed that essentially removed collective bargaining from antitrust. The Wagner Act, the Norris-LaGuardia Act, the National Labor Relations Act. Collectively, what they said was that the employment bargaining relationship between a union on one hand and a group of employers on the other, is outside the domain of antitrust. We want to encourage collective bargaining as an activity. Collective bargaining as an activity necessarily means competitors on the labor market side and competitors on the hiring side will actually all get together and negotiate some common work rules and wages and how people will be hired. So we're going to remove that from antitrust scrutiny. Later on, through litigation, some work had to be done to define exactly what that antitrust immunity was. And through a series of court decisions in the 40s and 50s, something called the non-statutory antitrust exemption for labor activities was created, which is basically anything that's in a collective bargaining agreement that could conceivably have anything to do with wages, hours, and working conditions for labor is also exempt from the antitrust laws. Not only can a collective bargaining agreement say, here's what your wage will be, and here's how many hours per week you'll work, and here's how many jobs the employer has to guarantee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in addition to that, it can do things like, say, a labor union and the local grocery stores can all get together and decide that the butcher shop of grocery stores will not be open on Sunday. All right? That's what the non-statutory exemption applies to. This is activity that isn't necessarily part directly of the wages and working hours and conditions for the employees, but has an effect on them that is part of the bargaining process. Well, now we fast forward to the history of professional sports and how labor relations in professional sports grew up in this strange context of collective bargaining having one set of laws and normal business activities having another set. Because if you think this through, if the professors at Stanford form a union, they can collectively bargain with Stanford and other universities. We could have the Amalgamated Association of Top University Professors. And on one side of the table would be bargaining for the professors, on the other side would be bargaining for Stanford, Harvard, Princeton, etc. And they could all set wages. They could even have a draft, where this year Harvard's economics department's a little down, they get the first draft of all the PhD students in the country. That's perfectly legal, but if there isn't a union, and Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton all sat down together and said, let's start a draft for PhD students, that would be illegal. That would be a violation of the antitrust laws. Now, this is directly applicable to sports, because how did unionization come about in sports? Well, unionization came about in sports because the leagues themselves had developed highly restrictive rules about the player market, that the antecedents to the rules we see today go all the way back into the 19th century. And they had never really been successfully attacked through the antitrust laws until players' unions came into existence. What players' unions did initially was go to players and say, we're all dealt a bad hand here. We live in a world in which our salaries are substantially suppressed by these various rules operating in the labor market. But let's at least negotiate some things like health care, a minimum salary, various other kinds of rules. And that's how they began. One of the great victories of the very first victory of player unions was getting the teams to pay their expenses when they're on the road, getting meal money, as opposed to paying it for it yourself. That was accomplished in the late 1940s by the first baseball players. So they were sort of nibbling around the edges, and then all of a sudden they got the bright idea, when a collective bargaining agreement expires, let's just do nothing, and when the owners continue to operate under the labor market rules that we had during the last agreement, we'll just sue them under antitrust. And lo and behold, 35 years later, there's been roughly 40 consecutive victories by players in antitrust suits against leagues for various aspects of player market machinations. So the circumstance we actually found ourselves in was that gradually, as time progressed, the restrictions in the labor market for professional athletes in all the team sports became more and more relaxed. So economists, with their trusty econometrics, got hold of a bunch of data and started estimating what is the effect of these various restrictions on wages. And the bottom line result is that prior to the introduction of any kind of free agency at all, players were paid roughly half as much as they would have been paid in a normal market for their services. As time has progressed, that number has increased. For, as you heard from Nikhil's presentation this morning, for rookies, it's still down in there in the 50 to 60% range of what they're actually worth. All right? But for veteran free agents, they're basically being paid what economists call their marginal revenue product. The contribution to revenues is at the margin of a player is roughly what their salary is. And because of this mix of rookies, people in the first few years of their contract, being paid 50 or 60% of what they're worth, and veterans being paid roughly what they're worth, what the market would normally produce, you have, on average, players are now paid 75 to 80% of what they would be paid if there were no restrictions in the market. At this point, there's very little left to be obtained through collective bargaining from the player's point of view. What is to be obtained now is to get rid of the restrictions. In order to get rid of the restrictions, you have to get rid of the labor antitrust exemption. That is to say, you have to create an environment where the exact same decisions and agreements you could make in a collective bargaining agreement that would have antitrust immunity because they were part of the collective bargaining process no longer have it because labor was not a party to that agreement and it was imposed on them by management. As a result, the first hint of the transition that we're about to enter came in 1989, when the NFL Players Association disbanded as a union. There's a process, a formal process in labor called decertification, which means that if you have a vote among the union members, and if they vote that they no longer want to be represented by a union, that's the end of the union. It can still exist as a professional organization. We Stanford professors have the American Economic Association that we can belong to, which is a professional association of economists, but it doesn't bargain with Stanford about our wages. Well, the NFL Players Association in 1989 voted to decertify and then sued the NFL for an antitrust violation in the restrictions on free agency that were then present in the NFL. They won that case. It was a jury trial. The jury found that the NFL had in fact violated the antitrust laws, that the rules they had in place were not reasonably necessary to obtain any necessary efficiency advantage, that they were simply there for the purpose of suppressing salaries and as a result were illegal. The trial was separated into the liability phase, that is to say, did the NFL violate the law? And then there was to be a second phase called relief, which is A, how much money does the NFL owe the players for having violated the antitrust laws?